My name is Margot Hayes, and I'm 66 years old. What I'm about to tell you changed my life forever. The funeral for my husband Ernest was the quietest day of my existence. The silence was agonizing, broken only by the cold wind and the sound of dry earth hitting the casket. There, beside his grave, my world was already broken, but I received a message from an unknown number that sent a chill through me, tearing my soul in two. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket," I replied, my hands trembling against the cool metal of my phone. "Who are you? Where are you?" The response was delayed, a silence that stretched out, thick and menacing. Then it came. "I can't say. They're watching the funeral feed right now. The insurance is the key. They set up the fall. Don't trust our sons." That moment tore my soul in two. My world crumbled when I saw Charles and Henry, my own sons, standing by the casket. Charles was strangely calm, almost smug. Henry stood a few paces behind, pale and rigid, avoiding my gaze. Their tears seemed forced, their hugs as cold as ice. The dread I felt in that moment was an anchor dropping straight into my heart. For 42 years, Ernest had been my partner, my refuge, my reason for living. I met him when I was 24 in the small town of Spring Creek. We grew up on the same dusty back roads, sharing modest dreams. I cleaned houses to support my sick mother, while Ernest repaired bicycles in a small shop he inherited from his father. We were poor, but we were happy. We had something money couldn't buy: real love. The smell of sawdust and grease from his shop was the most comforting scent in the world to me. I remember the first time he spoke to me. It was a Tuesday morning. I was walking toward the market in my faded green dress and worn-out shoes. He stepped out of his shop with grease-stained hands and smiled at me with a shyness that made me fall in love with him instantly. "Good morning, Margot," he said in a soft voice. "Need me to check out your bike?" I didn't own a bike, but I came up with an excuse just to talk to him. That conversation turned into dates under the big old oak tree in Town Square Park, then into promises of eternal love, and finally into a simple wedding full of hope. The first few years were hard. We lived in a 2-bedroom house with a tin roof. When it rained, we'd set out pots all over the house to catch the leaks. But we were happy. Ernest worked from sun up to sundown in his shop, and I sewed clothes for the women in town. When Charles was born, I thought my heart would burst with happiness. He was a beautiful baby with his father's big eyes and my smile. 2 years later, Henry arrived, just as perfect. I raised them with all the love in the world, sacrificing my own needs for theirs. Ernest was a wonderful father. He'd take them fishing in the river on Sundays, teach them to fix things with their hands, and tell them stories before bed. I fed them, dressed them, and comforted them when they cried. We were a close family, or so I believed. As they grew up, things started to change. Charles, the oldest, was always ambitious. From a young age, he'd ask why we lived so modestly, why we didn't have a car like other families. Henry followed his lead in everything, as he always had. When Charles turned 18, Ernest offered him a job at the shop, but he rejected it with contempt. "I don't want to get my hands dirty like you, Dad. I'm going to be someone important." Those words hurt Ernest deeply, though he never said it to me. I'd see him sitting on the porch at night, staring at the stars with a look of sadness. His son had rejected not only his work,
but his entire way of life. But the foundation of his ambition wasn't solid rock, my dear. It was a bitter, deep-seated shame. Charles didn't just want to be successful, he wanted to erase where he came from. I remember the exact day the change truly began. Charles was 17. A girl he admired, a wealthy girl from the other side of the county, drove up to our tiny house in a shiny red convertible, her parents waiting behind her in a perfectly clean sedan. They were picking him up for a formal dance. As Charles climbed into the car, I saw the look on his father's face as he glanced at our rusty tin roof and the sign for Ernest's modest bike shop. It was a look of pity, tinged with contempt. I saw Charles absorb that look. He wasn't embarrassed for us. He was furious with us. He felt the weight of our poverty like a chain around his neck. That night, Charles came home late, silent and rigid. He didn't speak to me, but he went straight to his father, who was wiping grease off his hands at the sink. "You could have been more, Dad," he spat out, his voice low and shaking with unspent rage. "You had a good mind. You could have left this dirt-poor town, but you settled, and we are paying for your comfort." Ernest simply turned, his gentle eyes full of heartbreak. "We had love, son. That was never settling." "Love doesn't pay for dignity," Charles yelled back. That was the chasm opening. From that moment, Charles's goals were less about achievement and more about revenge against the life we had given him. Henry, my gentle Henry, followed Charles like a shadow. It wasn't ambition that drove Henry, but fear. He was terrified of losing Charles's approval. His older brother had become his benchmark for worth. When Charles moved to the city, Henry went right after him, taking a minor role in Charles's new real estate company. Charles was the mind, the manipulator. Henry was the quiet hand, the one who executed the small, uncomfortable tasks. The years passed, and to my surprise, Charles managed to make a name for himself in the business world. He got a job at a real estate company in the city. Henry followed soon after. They both started making money, far more than Ernest and I had ever seen. At first, I was so proud. My sons had achieved what we never could, escaping poverty and building a better life. But little by little, that joy turned into sadness. Visits became less frequent, and phone calls grew shorter. When they did come, they arrived in expensive cars, dressed in fancy suits, talking about investments and properties. They'd look at us with a strange mix of pity and shame. I tried to believe they were busy, that they loved us in their own way, but then small things started to happen. The first time was a year ago. $5,000 vanished from our savings account, money meant for Ernest's retirement. Charles waved it away. "A simple bank error, Mum. I fixed it." Then a local notary friend stopped by, looking distressed. He mentioned 2 property deeds that had passed through his office, documents that assigned power of attorney to Charles regarding our land, which was now valuable due to the new highway. I realized that the signatures on those papers were not quite ours. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. And worst of all, Ernest started to get sicker, needing more care and attention. The doctor said it was his heart, stress, he said. But the stress wasn't just old age, it was the betrayal. Charles was constantly calling Ernest, pressing him to sign papers, talking about converting assets, causing my husband sleepless nights and spiking his blood pressure. I began to see that Charles wasn't just stealing our money, He was willing his father to die through relentless emotional assault. He was creating the very conditions for his plan to succeed. One night, the air felt thick and still. I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house and saw Charles, believing I was asleep, making a call on a phone I didn't recognize. Everything is set. The insurance money will be ours soon. The fall was perfect. Just stick to the plan with the signatures, Henry, and remember to keep Mom on the opioids they prescribed for Ernest's pain. She'll be compliant. My blood ran cold. Opioids? Charles was medicating me, making me compliant. My fear for Ernest turned into a fight for my own mind. I knew I had to act
immediately. The night before Ernest's supposed death, while Charles and Henry were in the city, Ernest and I had a final, quiet talk. It was a prearranged plan, a desperate gamble we had cooked up. Ernest didn't just get sick, my dear. He knew. A month before the planned fall, Ernest received a call from an old schoolmate who now worked as a compliance officer for a major insurance company. The friend noticed a huge life insurance policy, signed by Ernest, but with a recent suspicious rider, and the beneficiary had been quietly changed to Charles's holding company. He called Ernest with a simple, chilling warning. Get out now, old friend. They are planning a payout. That was when the secret weapon was forged. I went to the back of the house, where Ernest had hidden his old World War II ammunition box behind a loose brick in the chimney, a secret from our very first year. I pulled it out. Inside wasn't a letter, but an old USB flash drive and a handwritten address. The address was for a high-security assisted living facility in another state. Ernest was not just hiding. He was posing as a paraplegic, nonverbal uncle of Mr. Thompson's, our trusted lawyer, who needed constant care. The USB contained everything. Ernest's audio diary, detailing Charles's manipulations over the last year, copies of the forged deeds, and the recorded evidence from the insurance compliance officer. It was his proof, his legacy, and his key to justice. I knew I had to fight. With the help of Mr. Thompson and a few loyal friends, I started to uncover the full extent of their betrayal. The fear was a constant companion, but the memory of Ernest's brave choice gave me strength. Threats, blackmail, attempts to silence me. Charles was ruthless. He didn't care about the consequences, only the money. But I stood firm. Because I loved Ernest, I owed him justice. The trial was the hardest thing I've ever endured. Charles, arrogant in his expensive suit, presented his case, weeping manufactured tears about his heroic father and the inheritance that was rightfully theirs. Henry, pale and shaking, could barely look at me. Then Mr. Thompson simply said, "The defense calls one final witness." The courtroom doors opened. The silence in that room was louder than the funeral had ever been. Ernest walked in. He walked in slow but steady, his eyes fixed on Charles and Henry. The look on Charles's face, the instantaneous shift from smug confidence to utter, gut-wrenching terror, was the ultimate price of his greed. Henry simply collapsed into his chair, finally realizing the depth of the hole he had dug. When the truth came out, when Charles and Henry were convicted, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Justice was served, and the boys were forced to face the true consequence of their greed. Ernest and I, old and tired, walked out of that courtroom hand in hand. Now, I live with a broken heart, not because of loss, but because of what my sons became. Yet, I have a clear conscience. Ernest and I spent his final years in quiet peace, just as we did our first. I share my story to warn others, to remind you that true family is built on love, not greed. The greatest asset you can have, my dear, is a clear, honest heart. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it brings you a moment of peace,